Delighted to welcome you all to this webinar organized by Political Science Association and National Service Team, Wilson College. I would now like to welcome Ms. Namita Vaikar ma'am. Ma'am is a writer and a translator. She is also an author of the novel The Long March, Peking Tiger Books 2018. She is the managing editor of People's Archive of Rural India, Puri, and writes on gender, women, society, and culture with a focus on rural life. She leads and writes for the Grinding Song project, of which about 40 installments have been published on Pari. She is a partner in the Chemistry Databases firm in Pune, which is the culmination of a work of over 20 years as a biochemist and a software project manager. Today, she will be addressing us on the agrarian crisis in the 21st century India, her book, The Long March, work and history of People's Archive of Rural India, and also some laws to help rural India and the subsequent solutions. Without taking any more time, I would like to request our speaker, Namita ma'am, to begin the session. Over to you, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you, Ria, and thank you for your Political Science Association and the NSS at Wilson College for having me here. The topic for today, it's rural India, issues, challenges, and solutions. The topic itself is very challenging. I would like to say that first off. And I'll speak for some time and then I'll present a few, not slides, but some stories from Pari, and collection of stories from Pari, which are very much connected to the topic that we're going to discuss today. So when I was in high school, we had a Hindi book in our curriculum and it had a passage entitled Champaran Mein Gandhi Ke Saath. So it was an excerpt from a book by Dr. Rajendra Prasad, and the first president of India. And the passage was about Gandhi's first satyagraha for the cause of farmers in Bihar's Champaran district. And this was in April 1917. Now, the British administration had ensured that the farmers there would cultivate only a crop called meal, which was the source of the indigo dye. Now, the fluctuations in the price of the indigo crop caused much distress to the farmers there. And also the cultivation of this crop made the soil infertile. And we all know, and many of you are political science students here, that the Satyagraha in Bihar is what led to what would later become the non-violent movement for India's independence. So we see that a lot of turmoil that is caused because of what happens in rural India leads to certain movements, and that has continued over decades since that time. Now, many of us here have lived in cities all our lives. In fact, probably most of us, and that's true for me as well. So the very first time I experienced rural India was from a distance, watching gloriously green open fields pass by from the window of a train when I would visit my maternal grandparents' home in Nagpur as a school kid. And this was from a train journey from Mumbai to Nagpur. And sometimes I would spot women and men working in the fields or carrying headloads of large bundles of grass or hay. But it was only decades later, when I was researching for my novel, that I visited a few villages in Vidarbha. So coming back to today's topic, as I said, it's a very challenging one. And to address this itself, first we need to understand the lives of the people who live in rural India. Now, how can we begin to do that? How can we understand how they live, what is their life like, without actually being there, without talking to them? So let me keep that question aside for the time being, and I'll come back to it in a little while. Since the last year, we have all seen the impact of the COVID pandemic and the lockdowns, and more recently, the second wave and the vaccinations. Now, when the first nationwide lockdown was declared in March last year, we saw that thousands and thousands of workers from the cities, especially metro cities, were moving back to their villages. Some were fortunate to get away by trains or buses. Some spent a fortune trying to get standing space in other vehicles, like trucks and tempos, to reach their rural homes. These were people who were leaving cities like Bangalore, Mumbai, Delhi, Chennai, and other cities to reach their villages in states where they came from, Bihar or Odisha or Uttar Pradesh or Chhattisgarh and other states. So with what happened with the lockdown and the complete shutdown of almost all businesses, shops and offices, their livelihoods as workers in factories, hotels, construction sites, as well as domestic and daily wage laborers, these livelihoods ended abruptly, and they had no choice but to return home to their villages. They would rather die in their homes rather than in an unwelcome place in the city where they would have no facility available to them. So what we need to ask ourselves is, what compelled them to come to the cities in the first place? If we can find a few answers to that question, then we will make a beginning in identifying the issues and challenges that they face in rural India. Now, according to the census that was in 2011, it tells us that nearly 15 million farmers, main cultivators, were less than they were in 1991. So where did these 15 million farmers go? They went to other places to look for livelihoods, and obviously maybe a few of them went to other villages. Many of them or most of them went to the cities. Now, in rural India, we need to understand that agriculture is central to the economy there. In 1983, about 77% of rural households depended on agriculture as the primary source of income. This is according to the National Sample Survey findings. And the same number, the same figure in 2018-19 is 50%. So between 83 and 2018-19, the number has reduced from 77% to 50%. Going back to the same years, let's look at the GDP figures. In 83-84, the contribution of agriculture to the national GDP was 34%. And in 2018-19, it had gone down to 16%. So you see that the earnings are going down for every farmer when you see the contribution to the GDP also going down. So it clearly shows that agriculture, which is the mainstay of the rural economy, is not giving them what it used to earlier. This is a result of a multitude of factors, but one major factor is and has been the changes in our policies towards rural India, towards agriculture, towards livelihoods. And these policy changes have been happening over years, but the economic liberalization that started in the 1990s, that had a huge impact on the lives of farmers and their income. Very briefly, I will say that the input costs on fertilizers and pesticides went up, making the farmers, and which is 80% of these farmers who are small and marginal farmers, making their incomes go down because the input costs went up, but the money they got for their produce, the price they got for their produce was not rising at the same pace. Now, who are small and marginal farmers? Small farmers usually own land that is less than 5 acres, and marginal farmers own less than 2.5 acres. Now, many of them, when they have debt to pay back, they will sell their land, and from small and marginal farmers, they then become only agricultural laborers. In fact, many of these small and marginal farmers also work on other farms as laborers, because just working on their farm doesn't give them enough money to sustain themselves. So when farmers don't earn enough, how will the other communities of people in the village survive? And these are people who are involved in the weaving, in the pottery, in making iron implements. There are carpenters, there are folk artists and craftsmen and women. The customers for their work, who are the farmers in rural India, they themselves do not have money to spend. So even the art and the crafts and the livelihoods of all the other communities have also been on a decline. These are all part of the issues in rural India, and these have forced them to move into cities in search of work. So a craftsman who has been working on weaving saris, let's say, has come to the city, and now he's working as an auto rickshaw driver. There are many cases of that sort. Or a woman who has been a folk artist is working as a domestic worker in a city. And other than the fact that they manage to earn some money when they come to the cities, what is lost is incomparable. It's invaluable. You are losing an art, you're losing a craft, you're losing these men and women. They are losing the source of their joy and happiness which they used to get in their work. That is what they are losing, and they are trading it for just a routine a job that gives them the money, but not the happiness that their vocation would give them. But coming back again to agriculture, which is the mainstay of rural India, what happened was, to tackle the issues of agriculture and the crisis in agriculture, Dr. M.S. Swaminathan and his team had worked on certain recommendations, and the reports were published in 2005 and 6 over a period of time. It's very sad that these reports were never tabled in Parliament, nor were they discussed in Parliament. Now, was it not necessary for us to do that when such a huge population works as farmers in our country? Instead, or rather they are associated with the agricultural economy in our country. So, but what happened was, we saw that the 3 farm laws were passed, first as ordinances in June 2020, and they were passed in September last year, at the height of the first phase of the pandemic, as the farm laws. One that would not provide them an assured income as the minimum support price, although there are claims that they would, and it would not change. Then another law, the Farmers Produce Trade and Commerce Law, Act 2020, which says that farmers can get into contract farming and with different companies, but there was a dearth of ways in which they can approach courts for any complaints or any resolutions to the problems they face in these contracts. And the third one, the Essential Commodities Act, which 2020, which essentially means that large companies, large corporates that work in this field, they can hoard grains without the earlier restrictions of the Essential Commodities Act. So what was the outcome of all this? So when you look at these laws and you read the essential details of all these laws, it's not surprising that farmers are protesting at Delhi's borders. It's been 7 months now. 7 months have gone by since the protest started. And very understandably, the farmers fear that these laws will destroy their livelihoods by offering large corporates even greater powers over farming. Already the farmers are at a losing end when they are dealing with money lenders, when they are dealing with traders and agents who supply seeds and fertilizers to them, and all these are also part of the loan that they give them at high interest rates. And these farmers have understood that these laws will undermine the main forms of support for the cultivator, including the MSP and the agricultural produce market committees, the APMCs. So in March 2018, about 40,000 farmers marched from Nasik to Mumbai. And in November that year, in November 2018, which was just a month after my book was published, it just happened to be that there were about 80,000 farmers who were protesting in Delhi, and they had come from all over India. Now, among their main demands were freedom from debt and a fair price for their produce. One of the women in the group said, "We sell sugarcane to the sugar mills, but we have to wait for a whole year, sometimes for 2 years, to get the price for our produce. How can we survive? How will I run my household? Where will my children's school fees come from? We too want our children to go to good schools. We too want to be able to afford treatments and medicines for our health needs. How can we do that when we barely manage to feed ourselves?" Now, these are very basic questions, but they are hard-hitting questions that a woman farmer from Bihar was asking us, because they were hard hit by the rise in price of diesel and fertilizers. And another woman said, "We struggle every day just trying to cope with all these problems." And the word she used was, "Hum mar rahe hain, hum roz ke roz mar rahe hain." So, this is how the farmers are struggling in rural India. And this is not today. This has been going on for several decades. And moving aside from farming, what about health? What about education? If you look at the healthcare, the primary healthcare centers, they cannot cover all the healthcare needs of the people in rural India. So people have to come to the city. And if they come to the city, go to private hospitals, first to the public, then to the private hospitals, they cannot afford the treatment. So again, they take loans. So a large number of the poor who are indebted, they have incurred loans because of health reasons to be able to treat their family members. In the primary healthcare centers, you have the ASHA workers who form the backbone of the primary healthcare in rural India. Even they are earning not a salary, but an honorarium of about 6,000 rupees. Recently, they went on a protest march, a protest strike in Kolhapur, trying to ask for better treatment, better income for the work that they do. And as I mentioned, most of the debt that they incur is because of the health expenses. So let's go back to my earlier question. How can we begin to understand the issues and challenges in rural India without actually being there? So, as you know, I'm working with the People's Archive of Rural India, and our reporters are always writing about the issues and challenges there. So I would like to present a few stories here that would tell us a little more about these issues. So this is a category on PARI, one of the story categories called PARI Anthologies. Can you all see the screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Sure. So we have a collection of stories here. For example, the Kisan Mukti March in Delhi, which was this has the full coverage of the protest that happened in November, December 2018. Similarly, we have the Swaminathan Commission reports, because in Pari we also have a library section where we carry several important reports, and Swaminathan Commission reports is just one part of it. There are several others, like this is a full library, and when you go into what we call the rooms and racks, these are the different topics on which we have. There are reports on inequality, on climate change, on agriculture, of course, and on labor, on literature, and on census. We have several of the district gazetters as well. There are reports on the recent COVID pandemic and much more there. Other than the protest march in November and the one from Nasik to Mumbai in March 2018, we have the current ongoing protests that are going on in Delhi. A full coverage of this, the protest against the farm laws, which is on this page here. We have covered over 100 stories here, many more still coming up, and from all the different borders, about women farmers, about the teams working there, and what are the challenges they face. And there are farmers who have come not only from Punjab and Delhi, but from other places, from Maharashtra. The protests that happened in support of these farmers, which happened in Azad Maidan in January, and so much more. You can go to these stories to understand the issues directly from the farmers, because the stories that we carry on Pari, they are in the voices and the words of the people who tell them. We do not have opinion columns, but these are the kind of stories that we have. Other than that, we also have stories on the fight for the forests and the struggle for land rights. For example, last year we had a story on the mining mafia, that a group of women farmers from the Banda district in UP, they were fighting against them. I would also like to tell you a little bit about the Pari series on women's health. We spoke about the ASHA workers. I talked about them just now. So these stories tell us what is the condition of the health facilities in villages. How are the women coping with the healthcare systems? How are they coping with their reproductive needs? Are hospitals available to them? And these questions are not only about what is available to them, but also what the people will allow them to have. So we are talking not only about the economy, but also the societal setup in rural India, what's happening with the way they live, what are their day-to-day challenges. I mean, if I were to just say, on the to count them on one hand, I would say the problems are inequality, there are patriarchy, there's casteism, there is discrimination based on caste, there are discrimination based on religious conflicts, which are often exacerbated by political compulsions or voting election related compulsions of political parties. But to really understand these issues, one has to go to the village level and speak to the people and understand them. Similarly, in Pari, we also have Pari education, a section that is involved with students at the school and college level. And I would urge your students in Wilson College, as well as for your college projects or even for your NSS work, to try and work with our fantastic team of Pari Education, even though I am saying it myself. Our Pari Education editor is here on this Google Meet, and you can get in touch with her. I will share the email IDs of whoever wants to contact her. And here what happens is, like I said in the beginning, that we are so much a part of urban India and cut off from our rural roots for such a long time. But we fail to notice that there are rural Indians amongst us. You know, the women who work in a house, or the man who is part of the security guards in the building societies, or the people who drive the auto rickshaws, and so many more things. They are all migrants from rural India, and if only we were to speak to them, we would find out so much more. Recently, we published some stories by middle school students from a school in Delhi, and they interviewed these migrant workers and laborers in their city who they were able to reach out to, and it was a very great, very enlightening experience for them. It was very interesting to know so many things that they were completely unaware of. These are, of course, at the very basic level, but as students of political science and any of the other subjects in humanities, I think the library section that we have has something called factoids and summary. For example, if I look at this report here, I will see that this report on addressing the human cost of Assam tea, it has a focus which gives you a summary of the report. Sorry, can you see it now?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so it gives you a summary of the report, and it gives you the factoids, which, looking at this report, you will be able to figure out whether this is what you are looking for your research or for your assignment that you have been doing. And in short, many of the questions that we have to address the issues and challenges of rural India are the stories and the library reports that we have on Pari, and it's a great source, I would say, for beginning to understand the issues and challenges. So I want to say something else here about the solutions. It's a huge. It's not an easy thing, finding solutions to issues that have been decades old, going on for decades. And for example, after independence, India was not self-sufficient in our food grain. The amount we required we were not growing enough, and we had to import grain. And after that, we had the Green Revolution, and in 1970s, that's when we finally became self-sufficient. But there were other issues that came up later, because we moved from multiple crops to monocrops. Later, we began cultivating more of cash crops like cotton and sugarcane, and those had their own challenges. If cotton required irrigation, if sugarcane, which is the most water guzzling crop, we we were not mindful of the fact that we were actually growing it in areas which do not get sufficient water, uh, and which made our problems worse. And what happened in Vidarbha, in Marathwada, where we were trying to grow crops that require water, but we do not have sufficient water because these are rain-fed regions and they did not have sufficient irrigation. We are repeating similar things now in Odisha. So in Odisha, there has been a multiple thousand-fold increase in cultivation of crops that were not there earlier, in cultivation of cash crops, and those farmers will undergo the same, are likely to undergo the similar issue farmers in other regions of India have already faced. So we are not learning from what we have already experienced. What happened, as I was saying, what happened in Green Revolution was we became self-sufficient, but we also went towards monocropping. That was the time when a lot of farmers in Punjab were growing rice and wheat, and over time, a lot of groundwater was used to irrigate these crops, with the result that now the water table there has really gone down. It's gone to abysmal levels, and the soil fertility is also suffering. And to be able to support the agriculture, you have to use more pesticides, more fertilizers, chemical fertilizers, which has an impact on the health of the people who have to use it. So this is a cyclical set of problems and issues, and unless time is spent in understanding these by our lawmakers and trying to figure out easier and proper solutions for these, I don't think we will come out of it. Otherwise, we will be latching on to the solutions that are the most expedient, that we are looking at the solutions not from the point of view of the people who live and work in rural India, but we are looking at solutions that lead to only enriching the people who are already rich, or only helping us create slogans and campaigns, at election time, but not really creating meaningful solutions for the people who need them. So how can people like us help this? What can we do? We have to first of all start talking about these issues amongst our friends, in our drawing rooms, with our family members, at public forum, write about them, and also question our political representatives, our lawmakers. And how many of us really do that? How many of us go and vote? These are all interconnected with the problems we have. I would like to say something here about I would like to say something here about a story that we published recently. It was a story about a group of artists in Tamil Nadu, and they performed a dance art form called Karagatam, and for their living, they would perform this dance at temple festivals, at public events. And obviously, because of the lockdown, temples have been closed. There have been no public events or festivals happening, with the result that their incomes went down. And after we published this story, this story is by a brilliant photographer. He's a photojournalist with Pari called Palani Kumar. And this story was noticed by Tamil Nadu's finance minister, P. Tyagarajan. And there were some others also who helped in making a proposal to address this issue. And eventually what happened was a relief was provided to about over 100 such artists, and they were provided relief in the form of cash and groceries. Now, this is a good solution, a good beginning to the solution that they wanted. But is this is this the end of the solution? Is this the ultimate solution? No, because what we need to do is find out how can we help these artists eventually, because most of them hail from rural India. How do we help them carry their art forward? Do our educational institutions cover these kind of stories, these kind of issues and topics? Do we cover these art forms in our curriculum? Do we learn from them? And how can we how can you as students help in generating awareness about these different art forms? Every state will have their own different art forms, and how do we help bringing them up into public discussion? So I want to just give you a glimpse of that story here. So let me just share it very quickly with you. This is a Karagatam artist from Madurai, and she says that this wretched corona, there's no income because there are no public performances, and she's forced to take money from her daughters. So she's borrowing money from her daughters to survive. And how can we solve this kind of an issue? These are the kind of houses where they live. The house does not even have enough space to do cooking, so they are cooking outside the house. And look at the brilliant photographs here. In this photograph, you see a grandmother who has been a performer. She's a senior performer, and she says that she has trained many Karagatam artists during her lifetime, but now again, she is also in a state where her art is not supported. So what do we do about it? And another story that I would like to take a look at is from farmers protesting at Delhi. So these are farmers from Uttarakhand and Northwest UP. And they say that they will protest as long as possible. So when they came there in November itself, they came prepared to stay there for 6 months. And now it's been it's been more than that. It's more than 7 months. They have left their homes and they are camping here. They camp there through winter, through rain, and through the hot summer. Many of them are over 60 years old. There are farmers there who have been in the army before. I mean, they were farmers. Many of our Jawans in the armed forces are children of farmers, and a group of army personnel also joined this protest because they also hail from the farming community. So you find that there is a lot of support within the farming community among the from the different farmers, from the farmers from different regions and states of India. When the farmers came to Mumbai from Nasik in 2018, there was a lot of support from people in the city, from Mumbai. But is it the same happening now? Is it because of the pandemic that the support from the people living in Delhi has gone down? Are we paying attention to what's happening at Delhi's borders? These are the questions I feel are very crucial to be able to find solutions to the issues that are happening with farmers and the issues that are happening in rural India. Another set of stories that I want to cover very quickly are about the migrant workers who come to the city and who have to support themselves. This is the story from a remote settlement colony in Srinagar, where a family has faced severe challenges to get health care for their son, and who has cerebral palsy, and they are really trying to find some wage work for themselves. Now, these are the kind of challenges a family with a child with cerebral palsy, even in a city, uh, for them, it's a huge challenge. And if you find a similar situation in the rural parts of the country, how much bigger a challenge that is, because facilities are not available to them easily. So this family has to move from one place to another, trying to find solutions, not just for the medical facility, but also for their livelihoods, to first of all earn enough while they are on the move, to find the means to support the medical treatment, and the toll it takes on their own family's life, on the way they are treated by the neighbors, on from the way they are treated by the neighbors, by their own extended families. Because you see, when a family goes into runs into problems, it becomes difficult for others to support them, and it becomes difficult for them to then carry on further because they don't have support. Similarly, there was, during the lockdown, there was a story of cancer patients who came to Mumbai for treatment and who had to live on the footpath opposite the Tata Memorial Hospital, because they were not able to find accommodation elsewhere. And finally, it was NGOs who helped them out. One of our reporters tried to contact NGOs, and they were able to get some help and find accommodation for them. So what's happening as an upshot of publishing and writing and publishing these stories is, people who are unaware of these stories, they get involved. They see the stories on the PARI website, through the social media, through Instagram, through Twitter, Facebook, etc. And they get interested. They get interested in knowing, in understanding how difficult it is for these people, and many of them come forward to help them. These kind of reaching out by people to help the people in trouble, these are definitely welcome and these are required, but they are not the solution. They are not the ultimate solution. What the ultimate solution is, only if people are able to make changes in policies that will bring healthcare within the means of ordinary people, whether they are in rural India or urban India. They bring education to the people, good education to the people, so that they don't have to travel into other cities or other places, but closer to their rural India, to their villages. Also, importantly, the agricultural issues, the agrarian crisis, for which the solutions are really complex, complicated, and require a lot of patience and persistence from our policymakers, and a focus on the people who need these solutions, a focus on the farmers, not a focus on how profits can be made by changing policies, and how do we compete, how do we make the lives of farmers easy, while we are also trying to meet our aspirations to be a global leader, you know. So you cannot sacrifice one for the other. You cannot say that to be able to be a global leader, these are the things that I want to achieve. I want to have the biggest companies from India. I want these 2 companies or these 3 companies to become the biggest companies the world over. And while doing that, I am sacrificing what is actually important for the farmers of this country. You can't do that. I mean, if you want to do that, you can. But when you do that, you are sacrificing the lives and the livelihoods of so many people, the farmers of your country. And I've still not spoken about issues of gender inequality that happens in rural India, the issue of women farmers who are not owners of their own land. Women actually form about they do about 70 to 80% of work on farms, but they don't have land pattas on their name, and they do not get the benefits, the credit facilities that farmers should usually get. They also do not find representation in cooperatives with the banking and don't get the banking facilities that they would had they been the owners of their land. And similarly, when there are discussions about the issues of farmers, the issues of women farmers often get sidetracked and they are not really talked about. So I would say that this is a really broad and topic of a lot of wide-ranging subjects. And when I worked on my book several years ago, actually, and when I worked on the book, what I focused on was only a small part of the agrarian crisis, the issues that the farmers faced in Vidarbha, and a little bit on the issues that the farmers faced in the rest of the country, and how a person who is a farmer's son tries to overcome these issues. And he thinks, I'm talking about my book now because it has been mentioned so much in the posters and the invitations for this topic. So the person, the man who is a farmer's son, tries to address this issue by forming a political party, because at the end of it, all solutions have to be political solutions if they have to be implemented. And unless the voice of farmers finds voice among the political class of this country, the solutions to their problems, the solutions to people from rural India will not be found. What has happened is several of our MPs and MLAs, some of them may have hailed from rural India, they have connections there, but they have all gone on to become very rich in their businesses, in their in their lives as MLAs and MPs, and they are nowhere near the kind of issues that farmers face, and they are sort of disconnected from that kind of life because they are millionaires, billionaires, etc. And how then can they address the issues of farmers? And how are we as the people going to select representatives who actually consider the issues of farmers or the issues that rural India faces? Because believe me, the farmers have now come to the doors of, at the borders of Delhi to protest. In my book, I imagined that they would come right inside the cities, and they did. In 2018, they did from Nasik to Mumbai, and they did when they came to Delhi, but that was only for a few days. As farming and agriculture becomes more and more unsustainable for small and marginal farmers, many more of them are likely to come into urban India. And then how are the newer problems that face all of us are going to be solved, because there are only just so many jobs that are available. Are we creating newer jobs for the people who are getting freed from farming because of the compulsions created by our policies that will be created by these 3 new laws? And how are we going to address those newer challenges? Is the government willing to take back these laws? Is it willing to really discuss the issues that will resolve the agrarian crisis? Is it ready to table the Swaminathan Commission report in Parliament and discuss it in Parliament? Has there been a parliamentary session recently that we know of? These are all the questions, and I mean, we started with the issues that rural India faces, and to find solutions, we have to raise a lot of questions first, and these are all the questions that need to be addressed. If they are not addressed, and they are not going to be looked at by the current MPs, the current government, then I don't think we will find solutions. We will find probably shortcuts which will do more harm than good to the people who bring food to our table. I think I'll end my talk there, and we can open it up for questions.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for your discussion and lecture. So, participants, the floor is now open for discussion and question answer round. So, if you have any question, you can either post it on our in the chat box, or you can directly ask and unmute yourself. If you have any question, please post it in the chat box. And till then,
yeah,
we got the questions from our registration link also. And I would like to ask that one. First question is from Akhil Barwai. The question is, what and how local livelihoods can be created in rural India, specifically during COVID-19 and after when seasonal migration is held?
What and how local livelihoods can be created in rural India? And what was the second?
Yeah, after when seasonal migration is at halt. It is the same question asked by him.
Right, seasonal migration
is at halt right now.
Is at halt. Yeah, first of all, I think how can local livelihoods be created in rural India? It's a difficult question, because how do we as people here create local livelihoods in rural India? How do the policymakers create livelihoods? One of the most beneficial programs that started several years ago was the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Act, through which people in rural India were able to create, they were able to work for 100 days in a year, but that too was only for a partial time, right? 100 days in a year, and that work was not available to everyone. So do we, if I were to say that I want to create livelihoods for, let's say, weavers, and are we buying stuff that is, are we buying material, are we buying clothing that is created by rural artisans? Are we inviting rural artisans? Are we inviting rural artists to music programs? Are we treating them as equals with other artists? Some of you may have heard some of the talks given by T.M. Krishna, a musician who has been very vocal about the way musicians are created in, musicians are treated who hail from different backgrounds, from different art streams, like classical work versus folk, or upper caste versus underprivileged people from other castes, from the scheduled castes or from the scheduled tribes. Are we treating them equally? Are we bringing them into the mainstream? Are we giving them the platform to perform? I don't think so. Can we as students invite such people? If you have your, let's say you have your college festivals, can you invite some artists from rural India to perform at your college programs? Or do you want to be happy performing, the dance to the some of the latest Bollywood songs? Do we do that? Do we provide this kind of an opportunity for people? I think those are the ways to start providing livelihoods, to encourage the artists and the craftspersons from rural India to find ways in which you can give them the opportunity to perform, to create their art for you, to find ways in which these can be included in your curriculum. Are you going to study about Karagatam now? I mentioned one story. What is Karagatam as an art form? Can we study it as part of my course, of our college course? Can we invite a Karagatam artist to explain it to us? Why not? We invite experts from other fields. You invited me to talk on this topic with you. Can we invite someone from rural India to talk about it? Can we do that? Can we invite a farmer to talk about rural issues, challenges, and solutions? Am I a person more suited to talk about it, or would it have been good if we were to invite a farmer? I'm just stretching it as much as I can. Can we invite a farmer on one of your political science group forums and ask them to talk about it? Invite a woman farmer, ask her to talk about their issues. There are so many ways of doing these things. We need to think, in all these multiple ways, out of the box, to use a cliche, but that's how it has to be. I think I'll end with that.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your answer. There was another question posted by Akhil Bardwai.
Right.
The question is how to overcome health and educational challenges arising in current times.
Yeah, one of those challenges, of course, is in current times we have everything has gone online, and we know that it's very difficult for the people in rural India and also a lot of the poor families in urban India to give access to internet to their children to study. Can we provide them with internet connectivity? Can we provide them with phones that they can use? I know that there are some organizations who have done that, who have provided phones to, let's say, the domestic worker so that her children can, use it for attending online classes. Can we do that on a larger scale? But again, as I said, this is a limited solution. This is a stopgap solution. This is not something that is coming to them out of our system. This is not coming to them out of our policies. This is sort of helping them because they are our fellow citizens. How do we ensure that there is connectivity, internet connectivity there as well, bank connectivity there as well? How do we ensure that? These are the facts. These are the factors that our policymakers have to address, and we have to raise them in our questions, in our discussions.
The next question is from Anirudh Parke. Question is, can you elaborate about the present situation of women's health with respect to the availability of sanitary services?
Yeah, so like I said, we have a whole section on women's health and reproductive health on PARI, and the first thing is, in many villages there is still this tradition, so to speak, of asking the women to sit aside when they are when they have their monthly periods. So it starts from that. That creates a lot of pressure, mental pressure, as well as physical hardships on them, and the non-availability of easier solutions for themselves, for protecting themselves during their periods, the non-availability of sanitary pads. And one of our stories, in fact, it was noticed by someone, one of the film actresses, and she got in touch with a company that made sanitary napkins, and they got together and supplied them to the women in that village, which was a very good thing. But how do we make sure that they get affordable facilities, affordable sanitary facilities available to them all year round? Right now, it's very difficult. the women cannot exercise their own will for their contraceptive needs, for their reproductive needs, for them to decide that they would have only one child or two children. They do not have the agency to be firm on these, because they are influenced by the entire patriarchal setup that the society they live in. It's always the man in the family or the elder woman, the mother-in-law in the family, who will decide when they can stop having children, because there is always the issue of wanting a son, and that forces them to repeatedly have children until a son is born. These are very serious issues which exist currently, and we are covering them in the Women's Health series, and we have to address them slowly. The more educated the women are, the more likely that they will be able to. All the women that we spoke to said that our reporters spoke to said that we are going to educate our children so that they don't face these issues. So education is one very important factor, and reaching out to them. People who can must reach out to them. That's what I would say.
Thank you, ma'am. Next question is from Nivedita Bhave. Why farmers from Punjab only are protesting? Why not farmers from other states?
Yeah, actually, this is a mistaken notion that only farmers from Punjab are protesting. As I said, in 2018, farmers from all over India had reached Delhi. This time, it was difficult for farmers from everywhere to reach Delhi, mainly because of the pandemic. So in majority, the farmers from Punjab and Haryana are there. The fact that APMCs and MSP is going to be deeply impacted by these new farm laws, it impacts the farmers from Punjab and Haryana a lot more, because they have the APMC and the MSP that is in place in those states is much more streamlined than it is in the other states. For example, in Bihar, the APMC has been dismantled completely. The farmers there don't get the kind of MSP that they should. So many of them actually sell their produce in the mandis in Punjab so that they can get the price that they would want to get. The other, that was a question, right?
Yes,
and while the protests are happening in Delhi, there are protests happening in the rest of India. There was a protest in Azad Maidan that was by farmers from Maharashtra. A group of farmers from Maharashtra also went to Delhi. Two of our Pari reporters went with them. You can read their stories on Pari. And there were farmers from other states also who went there and who continue to protest in their own villages, in their own districts, in their states. So I think it's not right to say that it's only farmers from Punjab and Haryana.
Another question that we got from our registration link is from Anusha Vaman.
All right.
The question is, how can we curb rural migration, and what are the other ways to earn more from agriculture, just like we earn from other jobs like software companies?
Right. So how can we curb rural migration? I think if you provide the kind of facilities in a village that you get in a city, why would the people want to migrate? They don't. People have to. Not everybody has water available on a tap in their house. They have to walk long distances to fetch water. Many of them do not have electricity. If they have electricity, it is often off. If it is often shut down. The electricity supply, sometimes it at such times that when they need to run their pumps to irrigate their fields, it is way past midnight, so they need to work at those times. They do not have the kind of jobs you have in urban India. Our medical students, some of you may know this, that when our medical students graduate from MBBS, they have to do a certain amount of internship or in rural India. Many of them are able to pay up and opt out of that because they don't want to go to rural India to serve. So which comes first? Do we provide facilities there so that the rural Indians remain there, or do we create an inclusive environment where we actually go to rural India and see what's happening? We go there as doctors to work in a hospital there, in a primary healthcare center there. Can we, you mentioned in the question that, they don't get the kind of jobs or increments that we get in, say, software industry. How did the software industry do so well? From what I know, for several years, I think maybe 10 years, they got rebates, they got concessions. The software companies got concessions in tax payments, the kind of concessions that allowed them to make the kind of money that people make. For example, it made them, the owners of these companies, it made them so rich that they have become philanthropists now. Do we consider giving this kind of premium treatment or elite treatment to somebody who works on the farms? Do we consider giving the kind of price they require to sustain a good life? Can a farmer who has a substantial farm, I'm not talking about a 2-acre, but let's say a farmer who has a 10-acre farm, can he get the kind of income that his family give a good education, give a good healthcare system available to him or her, give the kind of facilities available to them in their village as we have in our city? I don't think so. That kind of priority is not given to rural India. Only when we do that can we say that they will be able to earn as much. Because when the prices of things go up, it's not necessary that the farmers also earn that much more. Their earnings remain the same, whereas it's only the secondary and the tertiary levels of trade that happen in between the farmer and the consumer that the money is made. So how do we ensure that this kind of inequality is broken, this kind of unfairness is broken? When we are able to do that, that is when the farmers will get more income.
Thank you, ma'am. Next question is from Krishna Shetty. The question is, now in rural India, accessing of education is major issues. It's considered as major issues, I can say. Due to lockdown and through online mode of classes in rural areas, students and below the poverty line, students are facing many problems. How to overcome these challenges?
Yeah, so this we actually discussed earlier. There was another question about education. They don't have online connectivity. It's not just that they don't have a phone or a laptop or a device to connect online, but they don't have the range there. The network does not reach there. There are stories on PARI which show that there are some students who go and sit on top of a tree to get connectivity to internet. How do we solve this problem? We have to provide connectivity there. We have to provide them the kind of facility that is available to the rest of us. Do we have that? I don't think we do. Unless we provide that, unless the government provides that, unless we insist that the government provide it, it will not happen. So that's the solution. We have to provide those things. There is no other, if there's something is lacking, then you have to provide it. Otherwise, how can it be solved? They don't have the kind of money to buy these facilities easily. You have to raise their income. You have to raise the minimum earning that a person would do for a particular job. We need to increase those. The labor laws that were passed recently during the pandemic, they also provided employers to increase the number of hours that workers should be made to work. It was increased from 8 to 12 hours, but there was no assurance of increase in their payment. Do we have a minimum amount that is that can be paid to people? We don't have that. It's always a bargain, and we try to reduce the amount we pay people from the unorganized sector for any kind of job. So unless those rules are changed, they will continue to be poor. They will not be able to rise up to the kind of standards you want them to.
There was this another question related to education from Akra Bravo Bandopadhyay. How to address the already broken down primary educations in villages?
I think schools have to be built there that provide the kind of education that they need. What's happening now is English is at such a premium that even in villages, the people want to send their children to private schools, which are very expensive. Why can't we improve the existing government schools in the villages? We've seen that happening in Delhi to some extent. The government schools in Delhi have improved. Why can't we do that for the education system in the villages? Can students be volunteers with as teachers at these villages or as facilitators to see that the village primary school is improved? Can some students make this a part of your NSS project? Take up one village at a time and try and see whether you can improve the primary school education there. We in Pari, we have, as I said, a division called Pari Education, where we are trying to address the question of education and the question of a more wholesome education, which deals with the real situation of rural India and the real life stories of people from rural India. Can we do something similar for these schools? If we are able to do that, then we can increase focus on improve the primary education in villages.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for answering. There is this next question from Gaurav Joshi related to farmers' protest again. Why farmers from one particular caste of Haryana, Punjab and Western Uttar Pradesh are present in the farmers' protest in Delhi? In Punjab, Dalits were penalized if they don't attend these protests. How do you see the caste on this ongoing farmer protest? These castes who are protesting are owned for a large land in these states, while peasants and tenants are largely missing from the protest.
Okay, again, I think this is this is also a little misleading, because if you read some of the stories that we have on Pari, the people who are there are owners, large landowners, as well as small and marginal farmers who are protesting at Delhi. There are also farmers from different communities, and there are also a lot of farmers who are Dalits. Many of them are agricultural laborers. In fact, if you see the stories that we have, you will see that there are landowners, there are small and marginal farmers, there are women farmers, there are Dalit landless laborers. All of them are protesting because whatever is the impact of these laws on a large farmer, that is going to have more or less a hard impact on even all the other farmers, and subsequently on the farm laborers, because they depend on working on the farms of the larger farmers. So I don't think this is an accurate report, and if you're talking about a particular caste, then you need to mention that, because I have not really followed which particular caste that you are talking about.
Right. So next question is from Vedanti Patil. How can we bring justice and jurisdictions of the court closer to the rural India?
Okay, I think there are district level courts that exist in India, and these are the courts that are closest I believe, from my understanding, that are closest to rural India. And that is where the village, a person living in a village would go to. But I think the more critical question here is whether they receive justice, whether their complaints are taken seriously, whether when there is a crime committed, whether it is accepted by the law enforcement agencies. There, when they go to a police station, is an FIR filed when they want to, or are they discouraged to file an FIR because the crime committed is by an influential person, and the person who is come with the complaint is from a poor family? We know that this happens all the time. Is there a way we can change this? Yes, there is a way we can change this. There are ways in which there can be maybe citizens who provide paralegal. I'm sure there are already NGOs who do this. I'm very sure that there are, who provide paralegal or legal advice to the people in rural areas on how to overcome these difficult situations. That's the only way. I mean, and there has to be accountability at every level. Do we have that? Do we know how often in a police station the people are not filing FIR when the complainant is from a particular community or from a particular gender? Do we know that, and how do we address it? Secondly, also, how much of an influence do our political class have on our police force? Is there a way to separate these two? Because we know that the police are directly under the influence of the ruling, whichever is the ruling party or the ruling dispensation at that level. How do we reduce that? That is a very that's a question that political parties have to address at the national level, at the state level, at every level. And unless we break that, I don't think we can resolve this, this nexus between this compulsion of the police force to be more loyal to their political masters than to the citizens. Unless that happens, we cannot change it drastically.
There's this another question from Yogendra Sharma. He wants to the rural population to shift their focus from temples to the other social infrastructures. So he's want to ask that how can he convince them
to change the focus from temples
to the other social infrastructures?
Okay, I'm not really understood the question, but I think what he means is we spend less on religious places of worship and spend more on other facilities. If I might hazard a guess, I think there are more people in India who donate to temples and religious causes than there are who donate to social and other relevant causes. I think that can change only through generations of change in the way of thinking and change in the way we educate our people, because we know that very highly educated people also tend to be very religious. There is nothing wrong in being religious, but if you're going to dictate your behavior towards your fellow citizens based on your religious beliefs or based on your religious compulsions, and you are always going to give primacy or priority to that than to what is really needed, then it's something that can't be stopped. I mean, it is something that we as a society, we have to evolve, and that can happen only if we, and especially your generation that is now going to be going to form the people who will be a part of the political class, or the next set of MPs and MLAs. Only can the thinking change if you decide to make those changes yourselves.
Ma'am, Next question is again from Yogendra Sharma. In spite of knowing all these problems and solutions of rural areas, all the problems are still persist there. It has
Yeah.
been 7 decades since we are planning. What should we do to make it a real impact?
So not all problems have remained unresolved. Let's not create a very black and dark picture here. There have been solutions. There have been some solutions. We know that those families where they place an importance on education, they have eventually got out of worse situations. There are those families which decide to educate the women in their family. They also come out of the situation much easier. Like as they say, you educate a woman, then you educate the whole family. So I think there has to be a stress on education, a good education, stress on discussing real issues in our education system, and not the kind of rote mechanism that we have gone through. At least I have gone through when I was in school, and I'm sure many others also do have the same. And the kind of exam system we have, where there is a premium on reproduction of textbooks and the content of different texts, rather than analytical thinking of trying to understand problems and trying to resolve them. I think if we do that, if we create platforms even in rural India for children and youngsters to discuss these issues openly, I think we will reach a stage where people will be able to enforce the kind of changes that we want, and not always depend on our elders, on our rulers, our politicians to find solutions, but sort of force them to find these solutions because of the way we bring up a more mature way of looking at things from the beginning, from the school level. I hope I have understood. I hope I have answered the question in some way.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for answering all these questions so thoroughly. And thank you, participants, for asking your questions. It's almost time. So, good evening. I hope you all have a good evening. I deem it a great honor and privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion. First and foremost, on behalf of our organizing committee, Political Science Association, that is PSA, and NSS unit of Wilson College, Mumbai, I would like to express my sincerest and heartfelt thanks to our today's resource person and special guest lecturer, Namita Vaikar ma'am, a great writer and translator, who despite her busy schedule has found time to grace us in this session by her honorable presence. I would like to thank you, ma'am, for joining and enlightening us with her profound knowledge on our today's topic of rural India. You talked briefly about all the problems, issues about the farmers and others in the rural areas in detail and discussed the solutions. You presented the stories also. We are grateful for that. Illustrated all about the PARI project and ASHA workers as well. We have been very fortunate and grateful to have you here with us, ma'am, and extremely thankful for the enlightenment, knowledge, and the sea of wisdom you have showered us with during your brilliant lecture. I'm wholeheartedly thankful and obliged for your time for preparing these all party presentations that you showed us. You did a remarkable job, ma'am.